On a ridge south of Jerusalem, just across the Kidron Valley from the Temple Mount, stood a worship site that did not belong to the God of Israel. The hill was called the Mount of Olives, and toward the end of Solomon's reign, when he was an old man, structures began to rise on its slope. Not a palace, not a fortress, altars. The biblical writer names them with restraint and with grief. A shrine for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab. A shrine for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. And these were only the most public ones. The text says openly that Solomon built high places for all the foreign gods his wives had brought with them, gods whose incense rose into the same Judean air that, only a few hundred yards away, was supposed to belong to the name of the Lord. 1 Kings 11 verses 7-8 places the offense in geography. The very hill that faced the Temple Mount became a competing skyline. From the courtyard of the house Solomon had built for the Lord, a king could now look east and see smoke rising that was not for the Lord. This is the image that organizes everything else in this story. Solomon's fall was not a private catastrophe hidden behind palace walls. It was a public, geographic, architectural event. It produced masonry, it produced incense, it produced a horizon, and it produced the only question the rest of the script will keep circling back to. How does a man who built the temple of the Lord end up funding the temples of other gods within sight of his own? To answer that question honestly requires more than blaming Solomon's old age or his 700 wives. It requires walking back through the years of his reign, layer by layer, watching where devotion quietly became negotiation, and where negotiation became compromise, and where compromise, given enough time, became a hill covered in foreign altars. What follows is not a moral attack on Solomon. He remains one of the most remarkable figures in the Hebrew scriptures, a builder, a thinker, a ruler whose reputation crossed the ancient Near East. But the testimony of 1 Kings is unflinching. The same hands that raised the Holy of Holies also raised the high places. Both things are true, and understanding how both can be true is what makes the story worth a careful, unhurried listen. Chapter 2: Gibeon and the Asking of a Discerning Heart. Solomon's reign did not begin in failure. It began with one of the most striking prayers in the Old Testament. After David died, the young king traveled to Gibeon, the most important high place of the era, because the tabernacle of the original wilderness meeting still stood there. 1 Chronicles 21 verse 29 and 2 Chronicles 1 verse 3 both make this point. The permanent temple had not yet been built. Bronze had not yet been cast. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar, and the scale of the offering mattered. He was not merely performing a duty, he was seeking the Lord. That night, in a dream, God spoke, "Ask what I shall give you." The offer was wide open. Long life, wealth, the death of enemies, victory over rivals. Any of these would have made political sense for a young king surrounded by the memory of his father's wars and the unfinished work of consolidating the tribes. Solomon asked for none of them. Instead, he said, "I am only a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in, and your servant is here among your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil." 1 Kings 3:7-9. The Hebrew phrasing is striking. Solomon asked for a hearing heart, literally, a heart that listens, not for cleverness, not for force, not for the kind of sharp political instinct that wins battles. He asked for the capacity to receive what was being said by his people, by his times, by his God. God answered, "Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life, or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has never been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I will also give you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that among the kings there shall be no one like you all your days." 1 Kings 3:12-13. Then came the condition the text records carefully. "And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days." 1 Kings 3:14. The wisdom was unconditional. The longevity was conditional. This is where a careful listener should pause. The promise of skill came without an if. The promise of years did not. God gave Solomon the ability to judge, but he did not give Solomon an exemption from the responsibility of obedience. Many readers glide past that distinction. The biblical text does not. The famous story of the two mothers that follows, the disputed child, the divided living baby, the sword held over both, was widely understood in the ancient world as a sign that the gift had truly landed. Solomon's verdict revealed the truth, precisely because he asked what a real mother would accept. The nation saw the wisdom of God in him. 1 Kings 3:16-28. From that day forward, his reputation began to grow. This was the young Solomon, humble, listening, asking for the right thing, standing inside the older worship tradition before the temple existed. Almost everything that comes later in his reign falls into shadow because of this beginning. Chapter 3. The building years and what they cost. The 20 years of construction that defined Solomon's reign are described in the text with unusual detail. 20 years total, the writer says in 1 Kings 9:10. 14 years for the Lord's house, 7 years for his own house, then the rest for administrative structures. The temple was completed in the 8th year of his reign, in the month of Bul, the 8th month, 1 Kings 6:38. The dimensions are given in cubits. The materials are named: cedar of Lebanon, cypress, stone quarried and dressed at the source, bronze cast by Hiram of Tyre, gold overlaid on wood, cherubim of olive wood, standing 10 cubits high in the inner sanctuary. Whoever reads the chapters in 1 Kings 6-8 carefully notices the architectural vocabulary. The most holy place was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in each direction, mirroring the shape of the tabernacle's innermost room, but now in stone and gold. The two cherubim stood with their wings touching each other over the ark, stretching from wall to wall, so that their combined wingspan reached 20 cubits. Everything was measured, placed, sealed, dedicated. When Solomon finished, he summoned the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, and the chief fathers of the children of Israel, to bring the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David, which is Zion. 1 Kings 8:1. The procession is described as carefully as a royal entry. The priests carried the ark into the most holy place, beneath the wings of the cherubim. Then the cloud. And it came to pass, when the priests came out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. 1 Kings 8:10-11. Whatever one makes of the original event, the writer is clear. The God of Israel had visibly entered his temple. This was not empty ritual. Solomon had opened his mouth to pray, and the next words recorded by the text are spoken into a room where the divine presence had just been made visible to the priests. The prayer that follows belongs to the same conversation. Solomon does not say that God lives in this building. He says that even the highest heavens cannot contain the Lord, much less this house. 1 Kings 8:27. Solomon prays that the temple will be a place where prayer rises, where repentance is heard, where foreigners who hear the fame of the Lord come and pray toward this house, where covenant faithfulness is renewed again and again over generations. This prayer itself is part of why his later collapse weighs so heavily. The man who prayed that prayer knew what he was praying about. He knew the structure of the covenant. He knew that sin required confession, that suffering required mercy, that exile required a way back. During these same 20 years, however, other things were quietly happening. Solomon built administrative districts. He stationed a garrison in Jerusalem along with the king. He gathered chariots and horsemen, 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, which he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. 2 Kings 10:26. He imported horses from Egypt and Kuwait and from all the kingdoms of the Philistines. He married the daughter of Pharaoh and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. 1 Kings 3:1. The biblical writer reports all this without explicit condemnation at the time. The condemnation arrives later, when the full pattern is visible, but the pattern is already forming in these building chapters, item by item. Chapter 4. The law of the king that he already knew. To feel the weight of what happened in chapter 11 of 1 Kings, the listener has to back up nearly 500 years in the biblical story itself, to the book of Deuteronomy. There, in chapter 17, Moses had already written instructions for the day when Israel would ask for a king. The text anticipates that day patiently. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you shall indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. Deuteronomy 17:14-15. The king is to be chosen by the Lord. He is to be one of the brothers, not a foreigner. And then come the three limits that future kings would remember or ignore. He must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself. He must not send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses. He must not take many wives, lest his heart turn away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Deuteronomy 17:16-17. Ancient Near Eastern kings did not see these commands as ordinary administrative advice. They would have seen them as direct restraints on the three sources of political power in the ancient world: military force and the trade economy supporting it, diplomatic marriages for alliance, hoarded royal wealth as the foundation of independence. The law of the king was a deliberate theological limit on what royal power could become. It gets worse, or better, depending on how one reads it. The king must write for himself a copy of this law in a book, and it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left. Deuteronomy 17:18-20. Every day of his life, the king is supposed to sit with the text of his own restraint. The reason given at the end is the killer, so that his days may be long, and so that he and his sons may continue to reign in the midst of Israel. The king must keep reading the law so that his throne will last. When the writer of 1 Kings tells the story of Solomon's reign, this earlier text is sitting in the background like a metronome. Every accumulation, every marriage, Every shipment of gold is a quiet pulse of the rhythm of Deuteronomy 17. Solomon's reign is not described against a generic ethical standard. It is described against a written law that the king was supposed to be holding in his own hands all his life. This is what makes the fall a fall. It is not ignorance. It is not an accident of late life. It is the precise failure the law had warned about. Chapter 5. Pharaoh's Daughter and the Slow Turning. Almost no other verse in 1 Kings quietly hints at the disaster to come the way 1 Kings 3:1 does. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The chapter ends mid-political project. She is in the city, but the construction is not yet done. The writer does not say this marriage was wrong in itself. Egypt at this moment was a weakened power, struggling under the last dynasties of the new kingdom, and the marriage was a diplomatic gesture of considerable scale. Pharaoh's daughter was housed in a temporary residence while the new royal quarters were completed. But for any reader who has been paying attention to the covenant structure of the Old Testament, the name Egypt cannot be neutral. Egypt is the house of bondage. It is the place from which the Lord brought his people with a mighty hand. Deuteronomy repeatedly warns Israel against returning to Egypt for military power and against forming ties that would draw them back. As the Lord has told Pharaoh, I will bring Israel up out of Egypt. The nation is defined in part by what Egypt was. To marry Pharaoh's daughter was to step onto the ground of a memory that was supposed to remain distant, and she was the first. That single line is what makes this verse the entry wound. The biblical record is plain. Solomon loved many foreign women, besides the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. 1 Kings 1-11, verses 1-2. The writer does not hide behind a single marriage that goes wrong. He names the nations, then quotes the very prohibition that had been in force for centuries, then says Solomon clung to these in love. The verb is intimate. He clung. By the time the writer finishes the count, the number has reached a size no reasonable ancient court could mistake for normal. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. His wives turned away his heart. 1 Kings 11:3. The lists in the historical books do not aim to be statistical snapshots. They aim to communicate scale. Here the scale is the point. This is not the lackish midget. This is not a youthful mistake. This is the systematic collection of foreign noblewomen as a deliberate expression of royal power, and the slow turning of a king's heart in the middle of it. The writings later attributed to Solomon himself, particularly the Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, and large portions of Proverbs, contain verses sometimes read as autobiographical reflections of the same season. Treasure in the arms of a foreign woman, vanity of vanities, the lure of women, and the price of gold. Whether or not these books belong specifically to Solomon's later life, the framing of 1 Kings 11 forces the listener to imagine, at least, that the prayer of Gibeon and the slow accumulation of foreign wives are both real and both true of the same man. Chapter 6. The Hill Across from Jerusalem. The heart of the story arrives at the most devastating phrase in the entire Solomon narrative. For it was, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. 1 Kings 11:4. The word holy is doing enormous work. Solomon was not described as apostate. He was not described as walking away from the Lord publicly. He was not described as closing down the temple. The text says, his heart was not wholly true. This is the language of division, of drift, of covenantal failure that is still dressed up in religious language. Then the writer does something devastating. He traces the visible outcome of the invisible drift. Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. 1 Kings 11 verse 5. The names are real. Ashtoreth is a manifestation of the older Canaanite goddess associated with fertility and with Phoenician royal cult. Milcom, also rendered Molech in some translations, is the national deity of the Ammonites, theologically associated in the prophets with child sacrifice and severe ritual impurity. Leviticus 18:21 lists the giving of children to Molech as one of the practices that pollutes the land. The writer of 1 Kings labels what Solomon did not neutral language, but refuse, detestable, abomination. And then back to geography. So Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, in the hill that is opposite Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. 1 Kings 11 verses 7 to 8. The hill opposite Jerusalem is, throughout the Old Testament, the most symbolically charged piece of land in Judah. It is the Mount of Olives, the same ridge where, centuries later, Jesus will ride into Jerusalem from the east on a donkey, and the same hill from which, in the prophet Ezekiel's vision, the glory of the Lord will return to the temple from the east. Ezekiel 43:2. Whatever the original audience understood, the geography carries the meaning. The worship of the Lord was supposed to come into Jerusalem from the east. The worship of foreign gods was now stationed on the east, greeting travelers before they ever reached the Temple Mount. The smoke met the road. It would not be honest to say, on the basis of the text alone, exactly what rituals were performed. The writer does not record a sacrifice. He records incense and sacrifice generally. He does not record that Solomon himself officiated. He records that he built a structure in which his wives did. The point is not whether the king stood at the altar himself. The point is that the entire throne, by the end of his reign, was hosting these altars next to the temple of the Lord. The Lord was angry with Solomon, says the writer plainly, because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. 1 Kings 11:9. Twice. The number is intentional. Gibeon, when he asked for a hearing heart, and after the temple dedication, when God repeated the warning. In the second appearance God had said, "If you or your sons turn away from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight." 1 Kings 9 verses 6 to 7. Solomon had been warned, twice, by God in person, in dreams, with threats attached. The drift of the heart, when this is the width of the warning, is not a small thing in the eyes of the writer. Chapter 7. The sentence and the mercy hidden in it. The divine verdict is short and severe. The king had not kept the covenant, therefore the kingdom will be torn. This is what the Lord had warned would happen under Deuteronomy 17, and it is what now arrives. The Lord said to Solomon, "Because this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant, and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and give it to your servant." 1 Kings 11 verse 11. Then the mercy. "Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son." 1 Kings 11:12. Unlike Saul, whose kingdom was torn from him personally, Solomon was allowed to reign to the end. A portion would remain for the house of David, for Jerusalem's sake, the city God had chosen, and for the sake of David who had served the Lord. Theologically, this is a serious moment. The judgment falls, but the promise to David holds. God's commitment to the royal line is not revoked by the unfaithfulness of one occupant of that line. The covenant the Lord made with David in 2 Samuel 7 still stands. The lamp of David still flickers in Jerusalem, even when the man on the throne fails. But the mercy is not a license to imagine that the unfaithfulness was free. The kingdom, as a structural reality, is now on a timer. Whatever stability Solomon's reign had created, the next generation would inherit a divided throne. And here is where the wilderness of complication thickens. God also does something unexpected at this moment. Instead of letting judgment sit as a future punishment, God begins to set up the agents who will carry out the division. Hadad the Edomite had already fled to Egypt during David's wars and had grown up in the household of Pharaoh. He returns. Rezon, who had once served Hadadezer, king of Zobah, and had become the leader of a raiding band, takes Damascus. Both of these opponents are described with the same verb. The Lord raised up adversaries against Solomon. 1 Kings 11 verse 14, 23. The word raised up is the same one the Old Testament uses for the Lord raising up deliverers in the book of Judges. In a strange twist, God is now acting within Solomon's story the way he acted during the era of the Judges. The faithful king had long been replaced by an unfaithful one, and the Lord is moving the nation toward the next chapter through something that looks, from the inside, like trouble. Then comes the third adversary, the most dangerous of all, because he comes from inside. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite, a capable man. Solomon, the writer notes, saw that the young man was industrious, and he gave him charge over the labor parties of the house of Joseph. 1 Kings 11:27-28. The Solomon who built with such grandeur had also enforced labor obligations that bent the same population whose land was supposed to rest every 7th year. Jeroboam was engaged with the weight of the building project. He was already close to the pressure. One day, leaving Jerusalem, Jeroboam met Ahijah the prophet on the road. The prophet was wearing a new cloak. The text records the clothing because the next moment turns the clothing itself into a sign. Ahijah took the cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, and said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes. 1 Kings 11:30-31. 12:10. A kingdom torn as a cloak is a kingdom divided. The ritual gesture by the prophet is the public image of everything 1 Kings has been describing in private. The reason God gives for the division comes next, and again it is explicit. Because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, and they have not walked in my ways, to do what is right in my sight, keeping my statutes and my ordinances, as did David his father. 1 Kings 11:33. The old elderly Solomon, with his heart not wholly true, did not fall alone. The kingdom that rises out of his failure will be the inheritance of his children and grandchildren. Chapter 8. The Last Years, the Death, and the Son who took the throne. Solomon's response to all of this is told with the brevity of a man who can no longer dictate the shape of his own story. When Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, Jeroboam rose and fled into Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and remained in Egypt until Solomon's death. 1 Kings 11:40. This single line contains several griefs at once. The man who had been given the gift of judging two mothers with a sword to find the truth now uses his power to threaten the man of whom God had spoken. He is not described as praying, not described as tearing his clothes, not described as assembling the people for confession. The text says he tried to kill. Whatever internal processes the king experienced in these years, the writer records only that the public man moved toward violence. The death of Solomon is reported in a single verse. The time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in him. 1 Kings 11:42-43. 40 years. Then a short sentence. Then burial. No poem. No psalm. No last words preserved. The text leaves him, as it had found him, almost without the inner life of his final years. This is one of the most contested silences in the Old Testament. Some readers turn to Ecclesiastes and find in that book, with its relentless cry of vanities, and its closing word in Ecclesiastes 12:13-14, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, the echo of a king looking back on a life that had been given many gifts and asked many questions. The traditional attribution of Ecclesiastes to Solomon in its final form has long standing. Other readers are more cautious and note that the writer of 1 Kings simply does not record a repentance, does not record the dismantling of high places, does not record a public restoration. For the purposes of this narration, the honest thing to say is what the text actually says. Solomon's lifelong drift ended with the Lord's anger, the prophecy of division, the rising up of adversaries, and an attempted murder. He died without an explicitly recorded return to wholehearted covenant faithfulness. Whatever hope is brought into the story, it comes from the mercy that keeps the kingdom's lamp lit until the next chapter, not from any explicit confession that closes the king's last days. The fact that he did die and was buried in the city of David is significant. He was honored, but the prayer of Gibeon does not visibly eat the prayer of the hill opposite Jerusalem. His son Rehoboam came to Shechem to be made king, where all Israel had gathered. Shechem had its own long memory, the place of Joshua's renewal of the covenant in Joshua 24, the place where Joseph's bones were buried. This was, geographically, a place of assembly. The people came with one request: your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he put on us, and we will serve you. 1 Kings 12:4. The request was measured. It was not anti-royal. It was a plea for relief from the building costs that Solomon's program had created. Solomon's reputation in international politics had been immense. The internal weight of that reputation was something else. Forgave. Rehoboam consulted the old men who had stood before Solomon. Their advice was careful. If you will be a servant to this people today, and serve them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. Servanthood as a strategy. That is what the older court proposed. He then turned to the young men who had grown up with him and followed their advice. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. 1 Kings 12:10-11. The writer of Kings sees the hand of God behind even this politically foolish choice. The king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. 1 Kings 12:15. The Lord was not the only actor. Rehoboam chose arrogance, but the Lord was using that choice to bring division. When the people heard the threat, they answered the way ancient peoples answered when the dynasty had lost its legitimacy. What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David. 1 Kings 12:16. The historian who was writing this had lived with the consequences. The two phrases, to your tents, O Israel, and look now to your own house, O David, would go on echoing for the next 3 centuries, until the northern kingdom fell to Assyria in 722 BC. The young Rehoboam sent the man who was in charge of the forced labor, Adoram, and Israel stoned him to death. The king himself barely escaped, getting into his chariot and fleeing to Jerusalem. The kingdom was now divided in fact, not only in prophecy. The cloak, torn in 12 pieces on the road, was now 2 kingdoms, geographically, politically, theologically. Chapter 9. What the Fall Still Says. To listen to the story of Solomon all the way through is to be left with no comfortable place to sit. The young king who asked for a hearing heart was given a hearing heart, and was given wisdom, and was given riches, and was given honor, and was given a temple so filled by the presence of God that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. Then came the houses, and the marriages, and the league of Pharaoh's daughter, and the alliance after alliance, until the king's household had become a small map of the ancient Near East. Each foreign queen brought her own gods with her. Each cult arrived in Jerusalem. The king who wrote 3,000 proverbs did not, in the end, write himself into a wall he could not pass. By the time he was old, his heart was not wholly true. The high places opposite Jerusalem stood as a quiet monument to the court's drift. The king himself had been warned twice. The Lord had raised adversaries against him. The kingdom would tear after his death. He tried to kill the man to whom the prophet had given 10 tribes. And then he died. His son took the throne. The kingdom broke. The rest of the Old Testament will pour out centuries of blood over what came next. In both kingdoms, kings will be measured by the same question. Did he walk in the way of David his father, in faithfulness of heart, or did he set up high places and lead Israel into the detestable things of the nations? The same question is the reason the story of Solomon will not stay buried in his era. Solomon's fall is not about Solomon. It is about what happens when a person with access to genuine revelation begins to negotiate with it. When the wisdom of God and the conveniences of empire can both be marketed as gifts, the man on the throne begins to weigh them as options rather than as authority. The slow drift is not a scene of open rebellion at the altar. It is a quiet series of choices in which one small compromise is added to another small compromise, until the king, who once prayed that God would hear his people from heaven, can look up at a hill in front of Jerusalem and see foreign altars whose incense is rising into the same sky. The first commandment still applies: "You shall have no other gods before me." Exodus 23. This is not a rule with exceptions for the powerful. And the New Testament echo, written centuries later in Greek to a generation who had forgotten the form of the warning, still says the same thing with 2 words of care: "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." 1 John 5:21. The story of Solomon does not enforce the warning by shouting. It enforces it by gathering, slowly, across the careful narrative of one reign, the evidence of what a divided heart looks like when it has time, when it has resources, when it has friends in the right places, when it has built the temple of the Lord with the same hands that build the high places across the valley. History is not tidy. The promise to David will hold. The lamp of the house of David will not go out, even when the man at the table of that house has stopped walking with the Lord. From this divided line will eventually come, in the 1st century, the king that Solomon was never able to be, the son of David who does not turn away, the king whose heart is wholly true, to whom, in the end, every other throne, in every other age, turns out to be pointing. The narrative of Solomon closes with an open wound. That is what the text wanted. The wound is not a failure of the Bible. It is the Bible's own honest warning to every future reader who might wonder whether wisdom, wealth, and religious accomplishment together can carry a man to the end, instead of obedience. The God who warned Solomon twice is the same God who exposes drift in any age, who calls the divided heart back, and who, in Jesus Christ, finally accomplishes what Solomon never did. He rules with a heart wholly true. For the listener willing to sit with this story, the practical shape is short. Watch the small compromises. Take the warning twice, as God gave it. Hold the law of the king in your own hands, as Moses commanded. And when the time comes that prayer has grown quiet and the altars of the world have grown loud, do what Solomon did not do in the end. Tear them down and come back. The hill that faced the temple is still a real place. The heart that faces Jerusalem is still a real one. And the God who walked into Solomon's temple is still the God who walks into every honest return.